What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. We have an awesome Switch 2 video talking about the potential ghosting issue for the LCD screen of Switch 2 and some of the things with the HDR as well on the screen itself. Now for the ghosting issue, I personally didn't even notice it or even realize it was there in my review. I play mostly docked, just as you guys probably are aware, but I did check out the screen, of course, on my own in that review, and I thought it looked fine, but there is a ghosting per se issue that you can notice if you examine it on Switch 2. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to also discuss an easy fix that Nintendo could implement to correct this pretty quickly, actually. But let's go ahead and get into it right away here. If you do enjoy this content, please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and we're going to get started. So here we have, of course, our friends at Digital Foundry. They did the review of the Switch 2, and they talked about how, the issues with the system as far as the screen is concerned. So we're going to take a look at what they said here, and then we're going to take a look at another video as well. So let's see what they say first.
The problem with Switch 2 is that the response time of the pixels, or at least the way it's being driven, is not adequate. And as a result, you actually do see a lot of sort of trails, blur on things. So if you're playing, say, a side-scrolling 2D platform.
Talking about the ghosting issues when you scroll on the screen, and they slow it down to 33% here.
Game. Like imagine you're playing Sonic on there, Sonic Mania. You got this checkerboard field. You've got a lot of contrasting colors. As it moves, the image essentially leaves behind. If you film at, say, 240 frames per second.
Filming at 240 frames per second, 11% speed, you can really start to notice some ghosting here.
For like a slow motion video, you essentially get 4 individual ghost images of everything on the screen. Your eyes perceive this as blur. It's actually slower than the original Switch 1 LCD from 2017. This is what surprised me the most, because
so slower response speed than the LCD on the Switch 1. And this is interesting, right? It sounds like a really bad, performing LCD, but let's take a look at more.
The nature of modern LCDs, I'm genuinely confused as to how this is the case. It shouldn't be that much worse, but it is. And as a result, it means that 2D games especially, or anything with a lot of lateral motion, just kind of smears in a messy way. And so I had some theories. My first thought was that, maybe it's doing 60 hertz in a 120 hertz container. But that really, on a sample and hold display, that shouldn't cause that much extra blur. It only becomes an issue if you're on a low persistence display. So I don't think it's that. What I think instead is happening is just there's a possibility that they're not performing any sort of overdrive on the image.
Yeah, so a lot of people were posting videos rage baiting on this topic on YouTube and on Twitter, and a lot of people who basically are Switch 2 haters jumped on this right away, and they went to saying that the Switch 2 LCD screen was garbage and that it sucks. And here he's talking about Overdrive, LCD Overdrive, possibly being turned off on Switch 2. He says possibly, but I'm going to show you another example is that, yeah, it is turned off, but we'll continue.
Right. So there's like a technique like LCD Overdrive that can be used to sort of adjust sort of the extra response time of the pixels. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how that works, to be honest. I haven't looked into that, but
at least he's honest. He doesn't know
it does
much about it.
To help. And there are other devices such as Apple's iPad, the mini LED iPads, for instance. Some of the older iPad screens, they also do not perform any sort of overdrive, and they have noticeably more blur in motion than a lot of other LCDs tended to. And there is things with overdrive. If you go too far, it actually causes sort of like a reverse ghost image effect. So
overshoot.
Overshoot, right? So it requires some sort of adjustment. But I think that as a result of that, if they implemented some sort of firmware-based overdrive into the Switch 2, they could potentially improve the motion clarity issue. So I do have a little bit of hope. But right now...
Would that impact battery life, though?
What's that?
Would that impact battery life?
Frankly, it doesn't matter.
All right. Yeah. So he admits he doesn't know anything much about overdrive, LCD overdrive. Basically, it is when you increase the voltage in your LCD screen, you can increase the speed of it, basically, of doing the display correctly, increasing the response speed. And that's what most panels use. They set their voltage at a certain rate so you can have less ghosting, basically. So he even brings up a firmware update, and I agree with this. I think that they can easily fix this with a firmware update for Switch 2. But that's not all, though. This is Digital Foundry. A lot of people have an issue with them, thinking that they're biased against Nintendo. I think they're just, not really correct in a lot of their things, and they're not really the type of guys you want to have reviewing an LCD screen. Just being honest with you. You want actual professionals, guys who are actually dedicated to doing this. So here's Monitors Unboxed. This is a side channel from Hardware Unboxed. They are a PC enthusiast channel that reviews PC hardware. They have a secondary channel that does monitors. These guys are fantastic, unbiased, and a very, very respected source for reviewing actual monitors. And here's what they say about the Switch 2 LCD screen. And again, these guys are unbiased, and they're not like trying to harp on Nintendo here. But take a look. We'll take a look at this and hear what they say.
The Switch 2 uses a 7.9-inch 1080p LCD screen that runs up to 120Hz and supports both variable refresh rates and HDR10. While Nintendo doesn't disclose the display technology being used here, its characteristics point to this being an IPS LCD. Also, while it does support 120Hz, it seems that the vast majority of available games at the moment actually run the screen at 60Hz or lower, and I was unable to perform any proper motion testing at 120Hz because of this.
Yeah, it's just too early in the system's lifespan. There's not that many 120Hz games just yet.
This particular LCD is extremely slow in terms of response time performance. I've seen some people on social media trying to dispute this, but unfortunately, the actual numbers don't lie. It's very, very slow for a modern LCD panel. I ran the Switch 2 through a series of 20 gray-to-gray transitions, not the usual 110 that we do for monitor testing because the Switch 2 had to be tested manually. And I did find atrocious results. These are gamma-corrected numbers that are measured in the same way we test PC gaming monitors. Using our test methodology, I found an average response time across these transitions of 33 milliseconds, with some transitions exceeding 40 milliseconds. These are terrible results and would make the Switch 2 the slowest screen I've tested by a mile, and that's out of 165 displays tested using this methodology. In fact,
yep, that's pretty slow. So he talks about the how we did that, some examples of the blurriness that's caused by the slowness of the response speed. And he goes on to, then he asks, answers the question about why this is the case. Now, pay attention very closely to this. This is very interesting.
Formed like this. So why is the Switch 2 LCD so slow? Well, one thing is clear, Nintendo are not using any form of overdrive on this panel.
No overdrive.
Overdrive is essential for fast response times on modern IPS LCD gaming monitors, and when you turn off overdrive on monitors, response times are typically much worse, though even still usually not nearly as bad as the Switch 2. My best guess...
All right, so when you turn overdrive off, even on normal monitors, it's still not quite as bad as what they're seeing here with Switch 2 in their tests. Why is that, though? Here's what he says, and this makes a lot of sense, and I agree with him here. Well, check this out.
As to why Nintendo haven't implemented overdrive is to conserve power. Overdrive applies a higher voltage to the LCD layer to force it to transition faster. Higher voltage equals higher power consumption. That's fine on a desktop monitor plugged into the wall, but not fine on a handheld device with a tiny 19 watt-hour battery. In addition, I suspect the display might be using especially conservative voltage tuning to further improve battery life, which would lead to even slower than expected native response time results.
And that's the key right there. Likely, what Nintendo did actually cheap out on, and let's just be honest here, was the battery on the Switch 2. It's not going to be good enough to, carry the amount of display that is needed. The quality and the speed is just not going to be enough. So they actually lowered the voltage enough here to make it so it was just in the range that maybe people wouldn't notice, and a lot of people didn't notice. Let's just be honest. I didn't notice. I didn't notice it. I have the Switch 2 right here. When I was playing it, like I said, I play in dock mode mostly, but I didn't notice it during normal play. And it makes sense that they will lower the voltage enough that it would actually cause more ghosting, but not enough for most people to notice. It makes sense here to conserve battery life. So what he says here makes perfect sense. It doesn't mean that this screen is actually bad quality, though. I don't really think the screen is bad quality. I think the screen actually looks really good in play. And he actually brings it out here in the review too, the positives about this screen. And let's take a look a little bit here.
Results. Given the Switch 2's display is larger, brighter, higher resolution, and higher refresh rate than its predecessor, this seems like an area that's been traded off to keep battery life in check. With response times in the 30 millisecond range, the Switch 2...
Yep. So it's a legit better looking screen than Switch 2, and especially in lower light, not lower light, but like reflective areas.
In at 1060 to 1. This gives the screen a poor black level in line with other IPS LCD screens that we've tested. However, the Switch 2 screen has much better reflection handling, so in most environments, the apparent black depth will be lower, giving the screen a richer and higher contrast look. The Switch 1's LCD is absolutely horrible at handling ambient light and ends up reflecting a ton of it, often making blacks look grey in all conditions
You
other
can see
than
the
pitch
reflection of the
black
guy
rooms.
waving on the screen.
One of the main improvements from the Switch 1 to Switch 2 LCD outside of the size and resolution is the support for a wide colour gamut. I measured 98% coverage of DCI-P3 on the Switch 2 LCD compared to 79% on the Switch 1. Both models have full coverage of Rec. 709, however that's where the Switch 1's colour gamut ends, giving it a standard colour gamut suitable for SDR content. The Switch 2 extends that to cover P3, which is one of the things the display needs for HDR content. The Switch doesn't appear to perform color management, so Switch 1 games, designed for its Rec. 709 display, have increased saturation when run on the Switch 2, giving the new screen a more vibrant look. This is because the colors are expanded to fill the wider gamut.
The Switch 2 screen has a lot of benefits over Switch 1, and that's why it's like an immediate upgrade when you see it. Most people would agree. The motion, though, is what has been what people have been having the issue with. But there's also this HDR stuff. Like, it does have the capability of actually outputting HDR on the screen, but is it actually doing it? It doesn't really appear so, per se. And I've noticed it as well. When I turn on HDR on the screen itself, I don't really notice a difference with it on or off on the actual portable screen. He talks about here why that's the case a little bit.
Things. One of the more controversial aspects to the Switch 2's display is whether it actually supports HDR or not. I mean, technically it does. It accepts and displays an HDR signal. From a hardware perspective though, in my opinion, this is not an HDR capable display. It simply lacks the required hardware to properly display HDR content,
Right.
And it has few, if any, meaningful upgrades to extend its capabilities beyond a typical SDR experience. The main issue with HDR on this LCD is contrast. The Switch 2's LCD has a poor native contrast ratio and no local dimming to increase the contrast in HDR scenarios. It doesn't even have edge-lit local dimming. As far as I can tell, there is just no dimming whatsoever. This means in HDR...
So that's a key feature to having an HDR display. You need local dimming, and the Switch 2 just doesn't have it. So you're not really going to get the amount of contrast ratio that you need to have a true HDR display. As you can see here in the examples, the contrast ratio is really, really low on Switch 2. So that's why it kind of doesn't really look like HDR, even though it technically is supporting it. And the color ranges support HDR as well. But the actual contrast doesn't really. So Nintendo may want to actually revise that on their... I think it's misleading and like a little bit false advertising there, saying that the screen is HDR, when it's actually not really giving you all the features of HDR. It's giving you the colors, but it's not really giving you the contrast ratio that HDR really should have.
HDR content, the maximum local contrast ratio you'll see is around 1060 to 1. For the best HDR experience, you'll need a contrast ratio that exceeds 50,000 to 1. So the Switch 2 doesn't even get close to that. With no real contrast advantage over an SDR screen, the true benefit of HDR, its high dynamic range, so large differences between bright and dark shown at the same time, that benefit is completely missing. Peak brightness is also insufficient for HDR, maxing out at 430 nits. The screen is brighter than the Switch 1, so in a side-by-side comparison, it will look brighter in the HDR mode.
Yeah. So it looks brighter, better colors, has has better contrast, normal contrast than Switch 1, but for HDR, it's just not cutting it. I'm not saying it's bad though. I just don't think it's a true advertising thing that Nintendo should be using for Switch 2 because it's not really producing an HDR result on your screen here. That's not really a huge problem. I would say people would notice more so the actual ghosting effect. And I have some footage of my own recording I did from my smartphone, and I didn't really notice much when I recorded it. But when they do the slow-mo test, and then you can see some ghosting. Some people I've talked to on X, I'll show you that in a second. Nice guys, they who own the Switch 2, they show their own examples. Some people are more sensitive to motion blur or actual ghosting images, and can make them nauseated. So if that's the case for you, then this ghosting could actually be more noticeable than someone else. But I do think it's not the norm for people to notice this as badly on the Switch 2 so far, because of all the hands-on impressions we had before the system was released, you never heard anybody talk about ghosting until they did the slow-mo test. Some people may have mentioned it on the side, but it's been a very small amount of people. Now, if you're one of those people who notice the ghosting, then by all means, let me know in the comment section. But we'll talk about more of that in a second here. Let's continue with this. Let's look at his final thoughts on if hardware unboxed, monitors unboxed, these guys who specialize in reviewing these monitors actually think that this is a really bad display for Switch 2.
So as someone that largely analyzes desktop gaming monitors, what do I think of the Switch 2's display overall? Well, I mean, it's not the best display I've ever seen, but we are talking about a handheld gaming device, so comparisons to desktop monitors only fair up to a certain point. This display is clearly not on par with a good quality gaming monitor. Even some of the relatively cheap ones we've reviewed easily outperform this, but I don't necessarily think it's bad for a handheld system. Compared to the original Switch 1 LCD, the Switch 2 is generally an upgrade. It's larger and higher resolution, which makes it more enjoyable to use. It's brighter and
compared to the original model, according to these guys, and I agree 100% that this is a visual upgrade, size upgrade, color upgrade. The screen just looks better than Switch 1. It doesn't look better than Switch OLED screen, I'll give you that. But from the Switch 1 original release, I'd say it looks better for sure, like easily.
and has a wider color gamut, which gives it additional vibrance, and it subjectively produces better looking images because of this. It has better reflection handling, so while the contrast ratio isn't improved, in actual usage conditions, it has better apparent black depth, and it supports more advanced technologies like variable refresh and a 120Hz refresh rate. The only real downgrade between the Switch 1 and Switch 2 launch screen is response time performance. The Switch 2 is definitely much slower, and both its 60Hz and 120Hz refresh rates are bottlenecked because of this. The response.
Yeah, so that bottleneck there, you got to blame it on the battery and Nintendo choosing to prioritize the actual image response time versus battery life. Something had to give there. And they were hoping most likely that most people wouldn't notice, like we said, and, you know, good on them. Most people haven't noticed. But for those that do notice, they notice it really badly. And, you know, I have some people I talk to. Real nice guy here on Twitter. His name is Gamer13. He said there's a misconception that you have to play in slow motion to see the issue. You don't. In my case, I noticed it instantly after playing Pokemon on mine because it was making me not nauseous. You see, I can't use poor response time displays. I'm sensitive to it. So yeah, it's a physical nauseating response that this individual has, and he, you know, he's not a hater. He owns a Switch 2. He actually returned the Switch 2. Got a new one to see if the screen was a problem, and he came back to me and replied and said he got a new one that still has the same screen issue. And the only issue I have with this footage is that he's always posting it in slow motion. He doesn't actually never show it in normal motion. But, you know, in normal motion, I posted my own video too that I thought it looked fine. But for him, it makes him nauseous, and he's not going to like stop playing Switch 2. He's just going to probably just play it docked to more what he was telling me in other posts. But if you are sensitive to this, then you're going to notice it, and you're going to notice it every time you play it. And I totally get that. So yeah, I don't really have a problem with it personally, but yes, Nintendo should be called out on having a very, very poor battery on Switch 2, and that's something we did talk about beforehand, before this was released. And that was one of the caveats and issues that they would have to deal with if they were going to choose to use 8 nanometers for their SoC. I said over and over again for months that it looked like this is going to be the system to play while docked. It was going to be a little bit hampered when you're playing on the go, battery life, and was going to be a big part of that because of them going with an 8 nanometer process. It's going to use more power and it's going to need more battery. And they went with a battery that it's not going to give them enough time, basically on the go. And to compensate for that, though, to make it a little less painful, they actually sacrifice the response time of the screen by lowering the voltage enough to make it so it actually can last longer for you. Go to Nintendo themselves and tell them that you want them to update Switch 2 with a firmware option to add Overdrive, so you can turn that on so you can have less ghosting or no ghosting when you play these games. That's the only way you can fix it. Otherwise, just don't buy the Switch 2 if you have that much of a problem with it. I don't see people really not buying Switch 2 because they're buying it like crazy. But yeah, like I said, if you have a big problem with it, go ahead and go out and tell Nintendo about it. I'll support you because I would like them to fix it myself. Even though I don't really use Switch 2 in portable mode that much. I would rather them have that option to make people who are sensitive to ghosting issues be not noticing it so they can actually enjoy the Switch 2 more. That's just my opinion, guys. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section. Thanks so much yet again. Hit the like button for me if you did enjoy this content, and I'll talk to you very soon in the next video. Have a great day.